It's an object like no other object, not so much a building as a thing. A thing like a pyramid or a druid's altar. An object of almost ancient reverence, a gesture towards the infinite like St. Peter's. Yet its Gothic arches point up to no God, only to an ideal of functional excellence. Unfinished, it'll cost £50 million. It was hailed by world architects as a turning point, a new dimension, the most unified big work of art ever designed. And yet, it's a failure, an appalling fiasco. A 4.5-acre, 220-foot-high scandal, an Antipodean Tower of Babel, the centre of a nation's debate on how much art is worth, and the greatest continuing local joke on record. Big white sails, a full wind, and nowhere to go. The Sydney Opera House, product of a people who had a genial bash at culture, and then went back to their beer. But oh, what a lovely bash.
Here in this God-given land of ours, Australia, this proud possession, our own piece of earth, that was built by our fathers who pioneered our heritage. Here in Australia, the land of our birth. God bless Australia, God Australia, all of the Anzac, the strong and the free. It's a home and our own land to cherish for eternity. God bless Australia, the land of the free.
So Francis Drake would have, if he could have, listened to the new UW. The one that really bowls them over.
The evening time is 26 1/4 to 12. We'll have the news coming away at 12 o'clock, and that's followed by Baby John Burgess right through till 4 o'clock this afternoon.
In a land where there's always a king tide running and a summer forever to spend on the beach. In a Pepsi-Cola culture, a gentler Texas of the South Seas, where the rough idealism of the bush anthem of the fathers is a far cry from the virile materialism of the sons, where history is regarded as a European luxury and culture a distraction from the serious business of pleasure, where noble headlands submerge under seas of red bungalows. Seems a bit odd that the people should perform a cultural act of faith and build an opera house when they had nothing to put in it. How did it happen here?
Australians believe that they have a kind of give-it-a-go quality, that there's something rather thoughtless about us. We like to kind of plunge into an action without thinking about it very much. And I think that that certainly is true of the Opera House. It was something that was just kind of bundled together.
Sir Eugene Goosens, the conductor, suggested it first. He vastly improved the Sydney Symphony Orchestra and wanted a big, permanent auditorium for its performances. He asked the New South Wales Premier Joseph Carl, a former railway employee, for a dual-purpose concert hall and opera house.
The Premier rather liked the idea of opera, probably just a vague, wishy-washy cultural idea. He may have thought of suburban daughters improving themselves, something of that kind.
Carl was the sort of politician that we've encountered only too rarely in Australia. For one thing, he was a superb political manipulator, or operator. However, unlike a large number of other political operators, he wasn't content just with power for its own sake. He was genuinely concerned to try and improve the quality of life in the state of New South Wales.
Somehow, in spite of its brilliant location, Sydney in the 50s still managed to look dowdy. Neville Cardis called it Manchester by the Sea. Carl felt it needed a focal point for its increasing wealth and sophistication.
Sydney is not a place that has any centre. It has no sense of social hierarchy, no common sense of social values. It's just a vociferous kind of place, dashing around meaninglessly like atoms, and out of all this dashing around, of course, sometimes good things can come, and sometimes bad things can come. In this case, it's a good thing, and something that could possibly, just possibly, change the nature of the city.
Now, if they'd been honest about it, they would have built a sports stadium. In fact, one's promised, but we won't see that for another 40 years either. They're still pushing the beaches. They needed something else, so they built an opera house.
Karl ran an architectural competition for a building on this site. Many entries looked like the big civic status symbol everyone expected. But there was an upset victory. Jørn Utzon had grown up in Elsinore in Denmark. Now 39, he'd won several competitions before and a reputation for being fiercely independent and uncompromising. And very few of these audacious designs had ever actually been built. One that was, a housing settlement, demonstrated his belief that a design should grow out of the landscape itself and look like a single living organism, a totality. Every rise and fall of the landscape should be left untouched, and the buildings moulded to enhance the location. And it was the location that excited him about the Sydney competition. A few hundred yards from the city's centre and yet completely isolated from it, it was on a narrow tongue of land jutting out into a graceful harbour. Anything he built there would be visible from all sides, and also from above, so there could be no ventilation pipes on the roof and no fire escapes on the sides because they could be seen. And somehow he had to build a massive theatre complex with big towers for the stage machinery into something as beautiful as the harbour itself. After months, he came up with a design that was like nothing ever done before. But by then, there was no time left to work out the harrowing details. So he sent in only the general sketches and imagined, therefore, he had no chance of winning.
The first prize of £5,000 was won by Danish-born Jørn Utzon. A storm of controversy follows. Some say it's wonderful, others think it's dreadful. It will cost £3.5 million, the winner of a world contest that should make Sydney and its people proud.
We don't need it. We've got a beautiful country and we've got all we need in it. Just by being here, we've got what we need to make a country. We don't need that much of it.
The judges said Utzon's plans were simple to the point of being diagrammatic, and technically they'd broken the competition rules. But as architects themselves, they felt that the general breadth of the imaginative concept was a more important consideration than rules. Utzon got straight to work. He chose as his engineers the famous English firm of O'Arup and Partners.
This was obviously something quite unusual, something, special. And naturally, from that point of view, I was extremely interested in it, because it's the sort of thing I like. In a way, it's much more exciting to have to do with something which really is a challenge. It was a form, it was a kind of sculpture which should be seen from all sides of the harbour.
The Premier said it looked like a crocodile. But despite conservative opposition, he stuck by his adventurous project. But he knew politically that the building had to get underway now or it never would. The Bennelong tram sheds fell.
The government would have done a better job if they'd left the old tram sheds there and kept the trams on the road. I mean, when it's all said and done, would I be able to go to the Opera House?
There was a question of whether this would actually happen or not. And this was all the time said that unless we can get a start now and make it fair complete, this is probably never going to happen.
Starting now meant they had to begin work on the site less than 2 years after they began work on the plans, which was 4 years before they should have. The early start was a political necessity, but it was an architectural disaster, because it meant all their mistakes would be in concrete and steel as well as in ink and paper, and the costs would skyrocket. Both architect and engineers protested loudly, but they had to bow to politics.
After seeing the world produce nothing but repetitive, rather dull, mediocre curtain wall buildings, it's understandable that this flamboyant, almost poetic gesture of a building was something that really caught everyone's imagination.
Harry Seidler, architect of Australia's tallest building, was one of the only 3 Australians whose entries in the Opera House competition won the commendation of the judges.
It was wholeheartedly accepted, not only what appeared to be professionally, but by the public at large. Everyone, literally, was just enthusiastic about it.
We have a sort of a sponge culture here, just soaking up anything that happens to float by across the Pacific. And that's why a lot of people were quite excited at the idea of the Opera House, because it could get us out of that. It could make us contributing members of world culture.
Carl had sense to know he couldn't build an Australian opera house on the people's love of culture, so he based it instead on the people's love of gambling.
First prize, 37610.
A lot of people weren't too taken with the ends of his opera house lottery, but most of them were delighted with the means.
This is Jack Leveson, 77.
The premature start gave the project momentum, and the lottery ensured its continuance. If the rest of the organisation had been half as good, it could hardly have failed. But the question of exactly what functions the building would perform was placed in the hands of a committee, and it was never finally answered.
When they built the pyramids, they knew they were going to bury kings. When they built the Gardens of Babylon, they knew they were going to hang. And even when they built St. Peter's, which was an edifice erected with a great deal more difficulties than the Opera House, there were people sacked, including Michelangelo. They knew at least it was going to be the centre of Christendom.
Utzon offered the maximum flexibility. 2 amphitheatres rose out of the great concrete platform, the larger for concerts, opera and ballet, the smaller for drama. The wide steps rising up to the concourse would keep pedestrian patrons clear of the traffic area that it spanned. Then the 2 streams of patrons would converge in the foyers and move into their seats, facing back toward the 100-foot square hole that would be covered by the stage. The stage itself would be made of 9 great lifts that would drop down to the level of the scenery area for set changes. A smaller theatre and chamber music room was set into the base itself. The early start and the many late changes had multiplied the problems of architect and engineer, and the base cost twice the original estimate. And then there was the problem of the roof. Although it posed enormous difficulties of construction, the engineers were inspired by the challenge of actually building it.
The whole idea, as it were, this extraordinary dream, this poetic thing which Utzon created, became a vision for all of us because it was so unusual in this day and age to embark on a project of this nature. And having been fired, one's imagination has been fired, one pulled out all the stops and we turned the whole firm virtually upside down, inside out, to try and meet this challenge.
But Utzon's inspired shapes weren't geometrical and they couldn't be built. So Arup suggested a new shape based on parabolas. But experiments proved that thin concrete shells of that size would fall apart. Doggedly, his engineers began the long search for something stronger.
This is a remarkable thing about it. It's called forth this concerted effort by so many people. We have alone had only over 200 engineers working on this scheme. So many people who have really given so much of their time and energy to this job for no particular monetary reward or fame or anything else. I mean, just because they were inspired by the thing. That in itself is a little bit of a miracle, to be able to keep that up for so long.
They tried different sorts of concrete and double skins of concrete with spaces in between, and concrete strengthened with girders and frames that began to endanger the simple conception. But the roof would not be moved. No amount in hundreds of thousands of formulas fed into gnashing computers would make the stone wings fly. The years passed, and the very shape that had made the idea of the Opera House so exciting, now it seemed was making the real thing impossible. They kept trying.
The more one heard rumours of the difficulty of designing it structurally, the more glee was expressed by the run-of-the-mill sort of practitioner. And this worked up into almost a crescendo of told you so, this is a mad type of thing to build, when there were rumors about that no structural solution could be found to this magnificent shape. But this, I feel, was very much silenced and would have been replaced in knowledgeable quarters by great admiration for the way in which it was finally solved.
In September 1961, Utzon had an idea. He saw that if he started with a sphere, he could make all the shapes he needed from its regular surface. This gave the shell a unifying geometry and made calculations simpler. And it was in line with his personal belief that the structure should be the form and the form should be the structure. It also made it possible for him to divide the shells into identical ribs and the ribs into segments that could be mass-produced on the ground and set exactly into place in the air. But this wasn't just Utzon's adventure. This was the People's Opera House.
Well, the three of us here, the gentleman over here is just about in Victoria, a couple of 100 miles away, while a lot of these other fellas, they've come from anywhere between Melbourne and a couple of thousand miles up the coast. And they're down for a few days. As far as the Opera House goes, I think it's definitely a necessity. As far as the practical point of view, as far as the finance goes, they've gone way overboard. It's definitely become, I think it's just becoming a political thing. Sydney definitely knows, I think at the moment we've got the town hall, which is really rather pucker barn. The stadium, which is an out-and-out barn. The Opera House is definitely needed.
In one stroke, almost like a Gordian knot solution, he found not only a way of, for engineers to compute the thing structurally, but he also found a way of building quite unbelievably complex shapes and forms with virtually industrialized means. And this, I feel, made this building a great thing by world standards.
A factory to make the segments was set up on the site. The problems weren't over. The fiercely committed engineers now had to place 2,194 15-ton segments in their exact theoretical position in space to within an inch. On a structure of that shape, the normal scaffolding method would be slow and expensive, so they invented a new construction technique altogether, a steel erection arch that could telescope out, fit the shape of each rib as it grew in the sky. Each segment's position was checked with computers, and then it was bound in place with tensioning cables and resin. When each rib was finished, the arch was jacked out to make room for the next.
The building itself, seeing that I'm in the building game myself, I think it's going to be a lovely job when it's completed. But that's all it will be.
I think it'll be the greatest asset that Sydney's got. It's by far the most beautiful building that's been even dreamt of. And it's got the peak position in Sydney.
Public criticism wasn't the only problem. Utzon was beginning to make enemies, some of them among his colleagues. The engineers had tried for years to design his parabolas, but then he had changed the problem to spheres and solved it himself. Some of the engineers were annoyed at his intrusion and angered by his hurtful patronising of their efforts. Also, the public were getting bitter over the cost. Without the engineers' agreement, the government had originally given an estimate of only £3 million. Now, as reality came home to roost, the estimates went up. But there was no real way of estimating how much something that had never been done before would cost. How much does it cost to go to the moon? You can only tell by going there. They had to invent a new method of building, and no one could say what that cost, and what's the right price for a masterpiece.
This is all right, but you could have done the same thing for $3 million instead of $30 million.
That's the grudge most people have got against it, the cost of the thing. But most people agree that it's worthwhile, for sure. What do you reckon? No, I reckon the cost is not extravagant. No, not when you compare it with some of the greatest buildings in the world.
Getting away to look for the lead in the middle of the field as they race in the furlong. Great Heart is putting on the...
The cost wasn't that much compared with, say, the £400 million New South Wales spent on gambling every year. But people didn't object to the cost so much as the purpose. The lottery money, they said, could have been spent on hospitals. And it could too. And so could its annual equivalent, their gambling money for 5 days. And the first realistic estimate of $17.5 million came out only a year before the state election. The opposition, 24 years out of power, gasped all over the headlines. And the people grew restless.
When you think you could probably build about 50 hospitals or 5,000 miles of road, which we need enormously, or build 5 dams for water, now that we're in the middle of a drought.
In the middle of a drought. Well, you got a point there.
Under the looming public threat, the Labor government ran scared. Carl had died only a year after he'd laid the foundation stone, and his successors may have wished that Joe could have taken his opera house with him. Faced now by a growing number of administrative scandals and holding power by a perilously small majority, the Labor government were only too happy to let some of the blame fall on Utzon. He was an artist after all, and probably therefore irresponsible. The press, always fond of a political melodrama, played it to the hilt. Utzon, not worldly wise, didn't understand why he personally was suddenly being billed as the languid wastrel of the people's money. But the people couldn't help feeling that the way the cost kept going up, and Utzon getting 5% of the total, that someone was making a quid somewhere.
Disapprove of the way the Sydney papers handled the whole affair. They've been very unfair to Utzon from the beginning. They only wrote about how many cars he drives, how he lives in the North Shore, and how much money he collects for him and his staff. And this was so much overplayed that the public had a mixed feeling against him from the beginning.
The government's manoeuvres succeeded only in worsening Utzon's situation. It lost the election anyway. The Liberal Country Party came to power, understandably ready to find fault with its predecessors. The new Minister for Works was Davis Hughes. Once a loud opera house critic, he now inspected the damage. It was politically advantageous to find it a complete mess-up, which he did. But he believed, too, that what it needed was the down-to-earth common-sense approach he found so lacking in his predecessor.
I had 6 years in control of the project, and it took me quite a while, I must admit, to really understand, or try to understand, what Utzon was planning and the tremendous difficulty of his work. And this required patience, it required understanding, and it required time to tune in with him. And I do, if I have any criticism at all of the present minister, it is this, that he rushed in here, fresh from an election, and made no attempt, apparently, Mr. Utzon complained that he didn't, and it's obvious that he didn't, to understand this. And of course, naturally, conflict did arise.
The building continued uneasily for a while, but then a situation arose between Utzon and Hughes that brought planning to a standstill. The trouble came over stage 3. For the glass walls and the interior of the building, Utzon again wanted to use his assembly line method, manufacturing thousands of identical units worked out by a sophisticated exercise in solid geometry. But when Hughes, in his straightforward way, said he wanted to see the detailed plans so he could send them out for tendering, Utzon didn't want to do any. It was more effective, he said, to do what he'd done before, select a manufacturer and work along with him until he got the desired experimental prototype and then manufacture that. He argued that he'd used this method on the tiles, and not only were they completely successful, but they cost less than any of the tendering quotes, and they'd been finished before time. Now for the acoustic problem of the ceiling, he wanted to use 50-foot long, 6-foot deep, hollow plywood beams, all the same prefabricated shape, all derived from the same hypothetical cylinder. And he wanted £60,000 to develop the prototypes with his chosen manufacturer. Utzon said the plans were impossible without prototypes. Hughes wasn't impressed. It was a clash of two kinds of practicality. The Hughes kind that wanted to see what it was doing and what it would cost, and the Utzon kind that wanted to do the job perfectly without regard for the conventions. Utzon now badly needed the support of the engineers, but over the 8 years of disagreement and strife, his once fruitful professional companionship with Arup had been whittled away. And now Arup was painfully aware that Utzon didn't even trust him.
The fact is that the collaboration deteriorated to a degree where it simply stopped.
This put him in a very precarious position because most Australians, I think, pride themselves on being intensely practical people, and if there's a dispute between an engineer who is more or less by definition practical and an architect who's always suspected of being somewhat airy-fairy, they will tend to side with the engineer. And this is, and when the new government came into office in 1965, they were presented with a very easy way of making Utzon appear the scapegoat for what had gone wrong. It was almost prima facie evidence that he was impractical and woolly and airy-fairy simply because he'd fallen out with the engineers.
The final argument was over Utzon's plans for the ceiling. The disagreement was trivial and in happier days could have been resolved. But now the engineers rejected Utzon's scheme and submitted two alternatives of their own. Intentionally or not, they gave the minister evidence with which to challenge Utzon's competence as an architect.
After all the rumours about the man not knowing what he's doing, it's taking too long, it's costing so much, and finally, when this whole thing blew up with the government, he obviously doesn't know how to make working drawings, and he's just a visionary and he can't interpret and can't put things into fact. Now this was very much, brought home to me of how wrong and how completely unfair all these statements were. When I asked finally to have a look at some of the drawings, he took me over the building and I was shown a great volume of working drawings of both the work that had actually been done and work that was projected for the second stage and third stage. And, I always think, as probably most architects do, that one is generally competent and one knows when you look at a set of working drawings, you would generally understand what it's all about. I can only remember the sort of feeling of genuine being humbled at looking at this unbelievable complexity and the audacity almost with which the man can deal with forms and shapes and translate them into technical terms. It defies description.
Australian people don't want this. They're not interested in the Opera House. They don't really think about it, I don't think.
Look at the time, it's 29 minutes to 12, and this section of our show is brought to you with the best wishes of Philip Morris Australia Limited. They're the makers of Marvel Boat.
The time when it really truly became controversial, there was no outstanding architect particularly to particularly take a stand on it. Harry Seidler came close to being a person in this situation, but really wasn't able to, because in a sense he's regarded as a reactionary and a revolutionary in Australia anyway, and so we were left without any person as a professional, as an architect who would be listened to.
But the minister had no way of bringing to bear the direct pressure he felt was needed if Utzon was to be made to see reason, because Utzon was still being paid regularly by the politically independent Opera House Committee and so could afford to sit out the stalemate. It was an improbable situation that the minister was quick to rectify. Surrounded, Utzon desperately fought back. He could only threaten to resign now. Foolishly, he thought this would panic Hughes into seeing reason, but Hughes wasn't at all distressed by the prospect. Everyone waited. So here was Utzon with 9 years gone from his life on the shell of possibly one of the world's great masterworks. Unable to finish it in the only way that he could build the masterwork that it was, ranged now not only against press, government and public outcry, but against his own engineers. And in a country that with all the goodwill in the world just couldn't see the things he saw or seek the things he sought. Believing that his own personal Sistine Chapel was being disemboweled by the bureaucratic process and he himself was being crucified by his friends, he challenged the government to pay him by a certain date or he'd resign.
Utzon may be a very great architect, but he's not particularly adept at political and administrative manoeuvring. And in the situation in which he found himself with a project of this size and in this environment, his lack of skill at what we might call bureaucracy tended to be disastrous.
But surprisingly, in a country where apathy is a watchword, the question did arise. 1,000 people marched on Parliament House, a lot of them fearing the Opera House would turn into one of the great Australian anti-climaxes, like Gallipoli or the messed-up capital city of Canberra. Angrily, they compared the minister's suggested committee to finish off the Opera House with a committee to finish off a Rembrandt. Many felt that Australia's anti-intellectual values had found their perfect expression in their politicians. The rural practicality of Mr. Hughes they called ignorant provincialism, and a great literature of vituperation was mounted against him.
You've got to build a building for not only the next 5 years, but for the next 100 years or the next 200 years. And this is the sort of building that the Opera House was, but it has now been destroyed just for a cheap political stunt.
Hughes was persuaded to negotiate. But even while he did, Hughes made it quite clear and publicly that with Utzon as architect, the building would never be finished. Utzon's last hopes now were that the Institute of Architects boycott the building in protest. Some wanted to, but the majority didn't. Or that Ove Arup would resign from the job in his support. But Arup wasn't prepared anymore to put his neck nobly in the noose for the man who'd accused his engineers of plotting against him and suspected Arup himself. And though he knew it was his support alone that made the government look respectable, and though he realised that the infuriating Utzon was indispensable, if the building was to be the masterwork he himself had already sacrificed so much for, Arup couldn't do it. He decided with some pain not to resign.
But I couldn't see that would make any difference. Utzon had resigned, you see. I mean, he had resigned without telling us anything about it, or without consulting us. And he even refused to see me. So, I mean, I couldn't do anything about that. And if it had made the government bring Utzon back, we would have said that we wouldn't work with Utzon. I mean, you can't work with somebody who thinks that you're working against the thing. I don't know. Yes, it is a conflict because it would be so much nicer to resign. I would much have preferred it. It's a very muddy thing, muddled thing, or complicated thing with all sorts of slightly human. I have been trying because this has been such a deep question for me. I mean, I've been trying to search my own soul, so to speak, for this thing. Is what we are doing, if we are not resigning, is it cowardice? Is it not getting into trouble, not getting into fight with it, not fighting the government or things like that? But I don't really think it is right. I don't think we ought to resign. And that's the result I've come to. I don't know.
Albert Einstein said in 1950, "Perfection of means and uncertainty of ends seem to be characteristic of this age."
Just now, a lady said, "Let's hope the pigeons don't make a home here." It's perhaps thought that Utzon had the idea that the sun's reflections off the tiles would keep the pigeons away. We're not certain, but perhaps that's why he chose the tiles in the off-white colour.
The shell was completed 2 years after Utzon left. 2 years for the minister to prepare his plans.
I think it's fair to say that we're aiming at maintaining the spirit of it. We want this to be a wonderful piece of architecture, which I think it is, so far as the externals are concerned. We want it to be something that not only Australia, but the whole world can be proud of. But I am concerned about the number of people that can be fitted inside, particularly in the major auditorium. But this is one of the problems that the new panel will face up to, and one I'm sure that they'll be able to meet very adequately.
With Utzon gone, one sort of logic had triumphed. There wasn't enough room between the seats for Australian taste. So logically, Hughes thought the Opera House's crucial problem was one of accommodation, whereas with a different logic, Utzon had thought it was one of shaping people's vision.
One big thing is the important thing in this house. It's the meeting between actor and audience. That means the stage opening and the auditorium, or the concert hall podium and the concert hall. These parts of the building are the main parts. They are as important to this building as the altar in the church. And everything we can do to get other spaces to guide you to these important parts in a festive and stimulating way is done. And I think we are getting more and more a building with a great personality in itself, a building you can't see anywhere else, because we have learned so much from new buildings, but at the same time this is so different from new buildings. So you get something which is up to date but personal for Sydney.
The design eliminates large areas where seats could be placed, which would have a very good view of the actual stage itself. And without committing ourselves on a complete change of design, the architects are obviously going to look at the change of design, which will enlarge the amphitheatre to provide more seats both here and in the gallery.
In order to make room for Australia's knees, Instead of having less seats, which would have made orchestral concerts uneconomical, the architectural panel decided to eliminate the stage. As there would be no room after that for anything but orchestral concerts, they advised the government to make it a single-purpose concert hall. Opera and ballet would go to the smaller drama theatre next door, drama to the experimental theatre to the rehearsal room, and the rehearsal room to the great gulf left by the tons of stage machinery which now wouldn't be needed. The Australian Broadcasting Commission supported the plan because the hall would now fit the specific requirements of their orchestra. But the Elizabethan Theatre Trust opposed it because they felt that what was seen was more important than how many saw it. The argument was extremely complex, but Hughes decided that he would decide.
Flowing from the decision that's been made, we will have the concert hall, which will be equal to anything in the world. We'll have the opera hall for 1,500 people, a beautiful, intimate theatre, which I believe will meet the audience needs of Sydney for opera and ballet for a very considerable period. It does have some stage limitations.
You've got 12 feet of wing space, and I really, although I'm being a little bit facetious, it's true. I think they're going to have safety nets to catch people, because if you have a ballerina coming off at a fair clip and she's got about 4 feet to go when she gets past the sight line, she's going to have to do something drastic to pull up.
Because of these changes, we'll get a theatre complex of 6,500 as opposed to 4,000. Now, surely this is not limiting the scope for the theatrical life of Sydney.
What's happened is that the Minister of Public Works, he's a very nice fellow, but he is the Minister of Public Works. And he has decided, in his infinite wisdom, that orchestral concert attendances are the thing that are going to remain constant in the serious music theatre for the next 50 or 80 years. He's chosen to ignore the fact that those audiences for those concerts all over the world are in fact diminishing. The visual things they've seemed to have just completely wiped. It's a staggering decision to have made, and very ill-informed. I really don't believe that the information is collected properly from anywhere. Quite strange. I remember the minister saying to me, oh yes, but I've seen Swan Lake in somewhere or another, and you know, it's the same here, but he saw it somewhere in a small theatre with 18 swans. What about Swan Lake with 32 swans? Perhaps nobody wants to see Aida anyway, but you could do Aida. You'd probably have to use baby elephants and dwarfs, but you could do anything anywhere. But that's not what it's about. It's to give them grand opera, grand ballet, grand spectacle. So what we're saying is that we'll retain the same mediocre standards of presentation because the audiences in Australia haven't seen it as it should be, and so they won't miss it. That's not true anymore because people are travelling a little bit more, and they know whether something is good as here as it is somewhere else. And I don't think that's what our exercise is about, to spend $60 or $80 million to do what's been acceptable artistically for the last 50 years in Australia. We should be doing the very best.
I've regarded as my task to get the whole project going to a specific program, to a time program, so that we will be able to have this wonderful art centre functioning towards the end of 1971. We've got a very experienced panel of architects who have done some tremendously fine work in Sydney.
Peter Hall, designing architect on the committee the minister appointed to replace Utzon.
I suppose he has very strong design ideas and intent, and in a way all architects who are interested in how things look are unreasonable people and selfish people, and so and I'm one of those, and so my own buildings are very different from this, but they're also not as developed because I'm much, well, a little younger than Utzon. I couldn't deny that there is an architectural loss in not having him finish this building completely as he would want to.
Arup's Australian partner Mick Lewis, who doubted Utzon's practicality and indispensability, was now very much in charge of engineering.
You've simply got to make the thing work now, and that has got to take priority over what might be a requirement for visual unity.
One of the things that's been said about Utzon, that he's a perfectionist, and it's been said as if that's something detrimental. Well, I couldn't say it was detrimental because in a way I'm a perfectionist myself, and but less developed in how I think perhaps than Utzon.
The next step in that exercise, which is in a way a more difficult one to put up with, is facing the facts of life, which we are now facing in stage 3.
But always you come back to this thing that, well, it's not your building, and you can't be the sort of, well, maybe in a way arrogant, unpleasant person. An architect often is about a building and about how it's made and about the demands he makes of the builder and of the materials he uses.
The realities, the difficulties which have been glossed over in order to meet the perfection in quality of finish and in sculptural form have resulted in functional problems which now we as engineers have to face because the original requirements which were set for the job are no longer applicable.
And then, of course, there's the architectural question of taking the stage tower out of the A2 shell, and I couldn't possibly argue that that is not an artistic loss, that it's in a way the unity of the architecture suffers from that.
The taking out of the stage tower, the one architectural justification for the shape of the building itself, shows perhaps the limits of the pragmatic approach. Utzon had stretched the definition of architectural function in any case, but when the stage tower went, it became just a building with a funny roof.
It was originally a dual-purpose hall in which live theatre, which includes opera, and symphony concerts were to be performed. When Utzon left, however, the new firm of architects discovered difficulties which eventually impelled them to actually change the use of the hall. We had stage towers here, very much bigger than the stage towers in the other hall. As a matter of fact, they went up to 154 feet above the floor. And we've taken them down because you don't need any stage towers when you have symphony and choral concerts. The open space behind where they're putting some wall work in was the actual stage.
And the $3 million worth of stage machinery went to its appointed suburban scrap heap. Perhaps in the next life, it will come back as something more practical. Ove Arup said before he decided not to resign, to destroy what may be a work of genius is a serious business, and the verdict of history will not be kind to those who could be named for it.
I myself think that, you see, when we first came in contact with this scheme and came in contact with Utzon and his own sort of his powerful influence in the way of inspiring people and so on, we certainly thought it was worth it, and everybody thought who came into contact with it, because the idea was to create something marvelous, something better than anything else, so to speak. I mean, masterpiece in every respect. More than just a building. but it's not sort of completely perfect anymore.
We've got interior decorators working on the actual design. There'll be 7,000 square yards of carpet, 4,000 square yards of furnishings, and the design of these things are equally important with all the other factors. We believe in it. We know that it has created tremendous interest, and very properly, great interest throughout the world. And we want to do nothing which will detract from the siting and the fine architectural conception of the original design. And so, from my point of view, the argument about the past is over. We want to achieve a building of world standards. I believe we will, and I think that when we open this complex finally, that people will say that the Sydney Opera House is the building of the century.
Apathy towards anything that's important. It's too much to think about. To them, rugby league, drinking.
But what is important about the Opera House?
Of course it's important.
In what way?
Well, it's a great tourist attraction for a start, and they need something like... What have they got?
That now.
What have they got here? Really?
This is Australia. Why should we change just because it's not right? And we don't want to think about it because it just happens around us, and that's it. We've got a beautiful country and we've got all we need in it just by being here. We don't need it. We don't want culture. We don't want it.
I think
we don't need things
You've got a great
like
chip
that.
on your shoulders. You want it madly.
We don't need it.
Of course you need it. You've got to have something that's something great. And the Opera House would be.
But not for that, that amount of money.
Australian.
And now, after it all, as the building proceeds apace of whatever it is, whatever cenotaph of whatever hopes, whatever great utopian prank that laughs over the water, and Utzon lurks overseas and threatens like King Arthur to return, and Hughes sits at home and says he can't think of any possible circumstances in which Mr. Utzon might be needed. And private people spend hundreds of their own dollars sending indignant wires to whatever international body seems appropriate. And the Labour Party that might have Utzon back sits sulkily in opposition and loses elections. It might be wondered, looking at it, whether a people's monuments accurately reflect their natures. Whether this cheery mess, this hollow gesture, this smiling shrug at the ideal it's betrayed, is a mirror of its makers, likely now because of its brilliant outside to bring them universal calumny. And it might be wondered too whether such things never come to pass, because they require the cooperation of fallible men and the leadership of inspired men, who can only finally repel because of their obsession. But it stands, a frosty, glad symbol of whatever you like, destroyed by cussedness, betrayed by cowardice, brought to this quietus by the politics that giveth and the politics that taketh away. Hallelujah, we guess. Hosanna to whatever's possible in the best of all possible climates. She'll do, mate. Or will she?
I finish?
Oh, I'm sure I will.
Even if I don't ever come to it.
I won't be here.
You never know, my dear.
Oh.
Because they've got a place for wheelchairs to go up. We might both be in our wheelchairs.
70.
But you must say he was a clever man, that Upton.
Oh,
Upton,
yes.
or whatever they call him.
Yeah, he was very clever.
He must have been to start that all.